When I imagined the apocalypse, I pictured myself somewhere dramatic. A military bunker deep underground maybe, a fortified farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, a shopping mall like in the movies with escalators and sporting goods stores full of weapons. I had seen enough zombie films to have expectations about where survivors were supposed to make their last stand. Instead, I spent 3 weeks living in a McDonald's off Interstate 70 in rural Kansas, surrounded by the smell of old fryer grease and the faded grin of Ronald McDonald painted on the play place wall. The golden arches are still lit up at night, by the way. They run on a separate circuit from the main building, and none of us ever figured out how to turn them off. Every night for 3 weeks, they glowed like a beacon in the darkness, advertising happy meals to a world that was no longer happy. I used to stare at them through the windows and laugh, because the alternative was screaming. My name is Derek Loomis. I am 26 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the night shift manager at that McDonald's. I worked there for 4 years, climbing from crew member to supervisor to manager. It was never supposed to be my career. I was going to go back to school, get a degree, do something with my life. But life kept happening and the job kept paying. And before I knew it, I was the guy who knew every inch of that building, every supply closet, every equipment quirk, every tile on the floor. That knowledge saved my life. It saved all of our lives. Someone should know what happened in that restaurant. Someone should know that you can survive the end of the world in a fast food franchise as long as you are willing to get creative with the menu. It started on a Tuesday night. I was working the overnight shift with Keisha Moore, one of my best employees. Keisha was 19, a pre-med student working nights to pay her tuition. She was smart, reliable, and never complained about the late hours. Our third crew member had left early, said he was feeling sick, which left just the two of us to handle whatever the night brought. The lobby had a handful of customers. Old Pete was in his usual booth, nursing his third cup of coffee. He was a regular, a Vietnam veteran in his late 60s, who came in most nights because he said he could not sleep anyway. Tamara Wells was at a table near the window with her 7-year-old daughter Lily, getting food for the road. They were traveling somewhere. I never found out where. Jerome Washington was eating a Big Mac at the counter, a truck driver passing through on his way to Denver. Around 1 in the morning, the television in the lobby switched to an emergency broadcast. We all stopped what we were doing and watched. The announcer talked about a rapidly spreading infection in major cities, hospitals overwhelmed, authorities urging calm. The usual stuff you hear before everything falls apart, delivered in that professional tone that is supposed to make you feel like someone is in control. Old Pete looked at me and said it reminded him of how the news sounded before things went bad in Saigon. I did not know what to say to that. The first sign that this was different came about 20 minutes later. A car crashed into the gas station across the highway. We could see it through the windows, the impact, the crumpled metal, the steam rising from the hood. Someone staggered out of the wreck, and for a moment, I thought they were just dazed. Then I saw how they moved. Their gait was wrong, lurching, twitching, like their body was not cooperating with their brain. The gas station attendant came out to help, and the person from the car grabbed him. I watched through the window as they bit into his neck. Tamara screamed. Lily started crying. Jerome stood up and said someone should call the police. I tried. The lines were jammed. I tried 3 more times while more cars on the highway started swerving, crashing, people spilling out onto the road and running. Some of them were running from things that used to be people. One of those things slammed against our front door. I locked it just in time. Through the glass, I could see its face, grey and slack, its eyes clouded over with something white and dead. It pounded against the door with the hands that did not seem to feel pain. More of them started gathering, drawn by the lights and the movement inside. I turned around and looked at the terrified faces of 5 strangers who were suddenly depending on me. I knew this building better than anyone. I knew where every piece of equipment was stored, where the emergency exits led, where the weak points were. If we were going to survive the night, I was going to have to take charge. We locked both entrances and started pushing tables against the glass. Jerome helped me move the heavy kitchen equipment to reinforce the doors. Keisha took Lily into the back and tried to keep her calm, while Tamara fell apart, crying and shaking and asking over and over what was happening. Old Pete pulled a handgun from inside his jacket, checked the magazine, and took position by the window. I did not ask why a 70-year-old man was carrying a gun in a McDonald's at 1 in the morning. I was just glad he had it. By dawn, there were maybe 20 infected surrounding the building. The news had stopped broadcasting sometime around 4. The emergency alerts just looped the same useless information over and over. I looked around at my accidental companions, at their exhausted faces and hollow eyes, and I asked if anyone wanted breakfast. We had plenty of eggs. Nobody laughed, but Keisha almost smiled. The next few days were about survival and fortification. I led the group in securing the building properly. The steel security shutter on the drive-through window became our main lookout point, since it was the only opening we could cover completely. Old Pete took inventory of what we had. His handgun with 2 spare magazines, lots of food in the freezers, and a basic first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic. Jerome suggested we block the large glass windows with something more substantial than tables. The only materials we had were in the play place, the indoor playground attached to the restaurant. We spent an entire day dismantling it, pulling apart the ball pit, removing the tube slides, dragging everything into the main dining area to create barriers. Lily cried when we took apart the playground. I promised her she could still play in it when things got better. I did not know if things would ever get better. By day 3, I had established routines, because routine keeps people sane when everything else is chaos. We set up shifts for watching the windows. We scheduled meal times using the restaurant's supplies. Keisha took over medical duties, treating the cuts and bruises we accumulated during fortification work. I figured out how to keep the freezers running on the backup generator, which meant our food supply would last as long as the propane held out. On day 4, something almost funny happened. An infected man wearing a delivery uniform wandered into the drive-through lane. He stood at the speaker, groaning, pressing the order button over and over. The speaker crackled with his moans, that horrible wet gurgling sound coming through the intercom system designed to ask people if they wanted fries with that. Old Pete watched through the security shutter and called it our first customer of the apocalypse. We did not serve him. On day 5, a car screeched into the parking lot. with infected chasing behind it. A young couple, Brandon and Mia Henderson, abandoned their vehicle and sprinted for the building. I had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision. I opened the side door and Jerome pulled them inside. We slammed it shut just as the first infected reached the threshold. Brandon was hysterical, shaking and crying and babbling about everything they had seen on the road. Mia was calmer despite a nasty gash on her leg. They had been trying to reach her parents in Colorado when the highways became impassable. Now they were stuck in a McDonald's in Kansas with a bunch of strangers. "Welcome to the club." Keisha stitched up Mia's leg using supplies from the first aid kit and a sewing needle sterilized with lighter flame. Old Pete started teaching the adults basic firearm handling with his single handgun. Jerome and I worked on reinforcing the weak points in our defenses. Lily drew pictures on napkins with crayons from a kid's meal box, mostly stick figures and houses and the golden arches rising above everything. We settled into our strange new reality. We had hot food, shelter, and relative safety. We also had a growing horde outside that got bigger every day, and a glowing sign that seemed to attract every infected for miles. On day 8, Jerome remembered he had a battery-powered radio in his truck, which was still parked in the lot about 30 feet from the door. Getting to it was risky. The infected had spread out across the parking lot, wandering aimlessly but ready to swarm at any sign of movement. We came up with a plan. Derek, Jerome, and Brandon would create a distraction at the front of the building, while Old Pete provided cover from the roof access hatch. It worked, barely. Jerome sprinted to his truck, grabbed the radio, and made it back just as the infected started converging on his position. Old Pete fired 2 shots that dropped the closest ones and bought Jerome the seconds he needed. We had a radio. We started scanning for broadcasts. Most channels were static. Some carried automated emergency messages that said nothing useful. One channel had a man reading Bible verses on an endless loop. Another had someone crying softly, the sound of grief broadcast to no one in particular. On day 10, a highway patrol car appeared on Interstate 70. It weaved between abandoned vehicles, moving fast, clearly fleeing something. It crashed through the guardrail and skidded into our parking lot, coming to a stop about 20 feet from the building. The driver stumbled out, covered in blood, firing her last few rounds at the infected following her. Her name was Connie Park. She was a highway patrol officer, and she had been bitten on the arm. Tamara wanted to put her outside immediately. Everyone knew what a bite meant. We had all seen what happened to people who got bitten on the news before the news stopped broadcasting. Old Pete argued that we should at least give her a chance. See if she turned. Deal with it then. I looked at Connie's face, at the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope in her eyes. I made the decision to let her stay. We would watch her. If she turned, we would handle it. Connie thanked me and asked if we had anything to eat. The next 3 days were tense. We watched Connie constantly, looking for signs of the change. The bite on her arm festered and swelled, clearly infected, but in the normal way. She developed a fever and sweated through her uniform. She was miserable and weak and certain she was going to die. But she did not turn. By day 13, it was clear that something was different about Connie. The wound was healing slowly, like any infected cut would heal. She was not becoming one of them. Old Pete suggested some people might be immune. Keisha said she had read about that possibility in one of her biology classes, how some diseases did not affect everyone the same way. I did not know what to believe. I was just glad we did not have to kill a cop in my restaurant. Once Connie recovered enough to talk, she told us what she knew about the outside world. The outbreak was everywhere. Not just Kansas, not just the Midwest. The whole country, maybe the whole world. Major cities fell within the first 3 days. The military tried to establish safe zones, but most were overrun almost immediately. Connie had been part of a convoy heading for a rumored government facility when they were ambushed by a horde on the highway. She did not know if the facility existed or if anyone else from her convoy survived. The information was useful, but not hopeful. We had 2 guns now, Connie's service weapon and old Pete's handgun. We had more knowledge about what was happening. We also had confirmation that no one was coming to save us. On day 15, a truck appeared on the highway. It moved with purpose, not fleeing, but hunting. It pulled into our parking lot, and a group of armed men got out. They cleared a path through the infected with brutal efficiency, gunshots echoing across the empty landscape. Their leader approached the building and called out. He said his name was Dutch, and he wanted to talk. Dutch was charming in a way that made my skin crawl. He had cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. He complimented our setup, said he was impressed we had lasted this long with such limited resources. He suggested an arrangement. His group had weapons and vehicles. We had food and shelter, partnership, cooperation, mutual benefit. I saw the way his men looked at Keisha, at Mia, at Tamara. I told him we would think about it. He came back the next day with more men and less charm. He gave us 24 hours to decide. If we did not agree to his terms, he would take what he wanted anyway. Connie told me she had seen men like Dutch before. They did not negotiate. They took. I called a meeting that night. We could not fight Dutch directly. We were outnumbered and outgunned. His group had at least 15 armed men. We had 2 handguns, a fire axe, and kitchen knives. A straight fight would be suicide. But I knew this building better than anyone. I knew where the propane tanks were stored. I knew which equipment could be weaponized. I knew that commercial fryer oil heated to 400 degrees could cause devastating burns. I knew that the walk-in freezer had a lock on the inside. We started preparing. Dutch came at dawn on day 18, just like Connie predicted. His men approached from 3 directions, trying to flank us, expecting easy prey. They did not expect what we had prepared. They did not expect the fryer oil I had heated overnight, poured across the main entrance in a slick that ignited when old Pete dropped a flare into it. They did not expect Jerome barricaded in the drive-thru with a fire extinguisher rigged to spray blinding foam. They did not expect Connie and Brandon on the roof with clear lines of sight into the parking lot. The battle was short and brutal and desperate. Men screamed as they caught fire. Others stumbled blind through the parking lot, easy targets for Connie's steady aim. Dutch himself made it to the side entrance before old Pete put a bullet through his shoulder. He retreated with what was left of his group, dragging their wounded into the trees on the other side of the highway. We had won. We had defended our McDonald's. Old Pete was wounded, a graze along his ribs that bled badly but was not fatal. Brandon took a bullet to the shoulder. My hands were blistered from handling the hot oil. But we were alive, all of us. That night, Lily brought me a napkin with a drawing on it. The golden arches, big and bright, with the word home written underneath in crayon. I realized that was exactly what this place had become. The victory was temporary. The battle had attracted attention. Gunfire and screaming and the smell of blood drew infected from miles around. On day 19, they started arriving. By nightfall, there were more outside than ever before. Hundreds of them pressing against our barriers, testing the windows. The glass started to crack. We knew the building could not hold much longer. We started moving essential supplies to the walk-in freezer, the most defensible space we had. Keisha discovered that the freezer connected to the roof through a ventilation shaft. It was a tight squeeze, but it was a potential escape route. On day 20, the front windows gave way. They came pouring into the lobby, a flood of grey bodies and grasping hands. We retreated to the kitchen, using the heavy equipment as barriers, fighting for every foot. Old Pete held the line at the kitchen door, firing methodically, buying time for the rest of us to climb into the freezer. I watched him go down under a wave of bodies. There was nothing I could do. The infected were everywhere, and the others were screaming for me to close the freezer door. I slammed it shut and threw the lock as dead hands pounded against the steel. We climbed through the ventilation shaft in darkness, feeling our way upward, listening to the sounds of the restaurant being torn apart below us. When we emerged onto the roof, the sun was just starting to rise. I looked down at the McDonald's that had been our home for 3 weeks. The infected were everywhere, swarming through the broken windows, destroying everything we had built. The golden arches still glowed above it all, bright and absurd and indestructible. Then I saw headlights on the highway. A convoy of military vehicles was moving along Interstate 70, the first organized presence we had seen since the outbreak began. I grabbed a flare from Connie's belt and fired it into the sky without thinking. The convoy stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a spotlight swept across the roof, and a voice on a loudspeaker told us to stay where we were, that help was coming. Helicopters arrived as dawn broke fully over the Kansas plains. They lowered ladders and pulled us up one by one, the survivors of 3 weeks in a fast food restaurant. As we lifted off, I looked down at the golden arches one last time. They were still glowing. Hundreds of infected swarmed beneath them, reaching up toward the helicopters, groaning their endless hunger at the sky. I laughed, because I did not know what else to do. The military took us to a temporary base about 50 miles away. It was crowded and chaotic, but it was organized. Real soldiers with real weapons and real plans. We were processed, checked for bites, given food and water that did not come from a freezer. I refused to be separated from my group. I argued with soldiers until an officer intervened. She asked who we were, where we came from. I told her we had survived 3 weeks in a McDonald's off exit 127. She did not believe me at first. Then she laughed and said she had heard stranger things in the past few weeks. I found the others in a makeshift medical tent. Brandon's shoulder was being treated properly. Connie was being studied by doctors fascinated by her apparent immunity. Keisha was already helping with other patients, unable to sit still even after everything we had been through. Mia and Tamara were sitting with Lily, who was eating her first meal in 3 weeks that did not come from a McDonald's kitchen. Jerome was telling soldiers about our fortifications with obvious pride, describing how we had turned a fast food restaurant into a defensible position. We did not talk about old Pete much. I know I should feel grief, and I do, but mostly I feel gratitude. He gave us time when time was the only thing that mattered. He held that door so the rest of us could escape. I hope it was quick. I hope he did not become one of them. I like to think he is still out there somewhere, sitting in a booth in whatever afterlife exists, drinking coffee and watching the door. That night, I lay on a military cot in a crowded tent full of other survivors. I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the McDonald's, about the golden arches glowing in the dark, about how absurd it all was. I survived the apocalypse eating chicken nuggets and McMuffins. I defended my life with fryer oil and fire extinguishers. I lost a good man in front of a ball pit. 3 weeks ago, I was a night shift manager worried about inventory reports and employee schedules. Now I am a survivor of something that might be the end of human civilization. I do not know what happens next. The military has plans, evacuation routes, talk of safe zones somewhere out west. I do not know if any of it will work. I do not know if humanity survives this. What I do know is that I survived because of strangers who became family. Old Pete, who should have been home sleeping but was eating coffee in a McDonald's at 1 in the morning. Keisha, who stayed calm when everything fell apart and stitched wounds with steady hands. Jerome, who used his size and strength to protect people he had never met before that night. Tamara, who was terrified every moment, but never stopped trying to keep her daughter safe. Lily, who drew pictures on napkins and reminded us what we were fighting for. The Hendersons, who stumbled into our lives fleeing death and stayed to help us fight. Connie, who should have died from that bite, but did not, and who taught us that some things cannot be predicted or explained. And old Pete, always old Pete. I will carry him with me for the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be. If you are reading this and the world has not ended yet, go to your local McDonald's. Order something. Look around at the people eating their burgers and checking their phones and complaining about how long the line is taking. Now, imagine spending 3 weeks with those strangers, fighting for your lives, turning that ridiculous building into the only safe ground for miles. It sounds absurd, I know. But when the world falls apart, you do not get to choose your fortress. You work with what you have. We had a McDonald's. We made it work. Somewhere out there, those golden arches are probably still glowing, still advertising happy meals to a world that forgot how to be happy. The infected are probably still swarming around them, drawn by the light, too stupid to understand that there is nothing left inside. I hope someone turns them off eventually, but part of me hopes they keep glowing forever. A stupid, stubborn light in the darkness, just like us.